Yeah, thank you so much for inviting me to be here and speak to you all today. It's exciting to share this piece of my research. It's, as I said, a kind of spin-off of the monograph that I just completed, called Performing the Buddhist Body. And so I'll start with the context here. I'm currently in the process of revising and expanding this paper, publishing as an article, and I'd be grateful for your feedback. It extends the approach I take in the monograph in new directions. So I want to start with some of those arguments just to give you that background. So in Performing the Buddhist Body, what I'm trying to do is propose and demonstrate a new set of methods for reading Buddhist sutras. These methods emerge from a dialogue between ritual performative frameworks that inform especially the Sarana Pundalika and the Suvarna Pravasutama Sutras, that's the Lotus Sutra and the Sutra of Utmost Golden Radiance, and contemporary notions of performance, performative utterance, and performativity. So in a nutshell, these sutras claim to be the body of the Buddha. And whenever people hear, memorize, study, or otherwise engage with them, the Buddha's body not only speaks, but acts, right? Through and within the bodies of its performers, who become future Buddhas themselves thereby. Okay? So I read these sutras not primarily as doctrinal works, but as self-proclaimed poetic rituals of immortalization, right? Performative utterances that preserve the Buddha's life essence, and which is the speech, right? And enable him to speak and act in the world anew whenever a Dharmavanaka or performer of Dharma utters his words. Okay? So recognizing the South Asian ritual cosmology that informs the sutras demands that we develop methods of reading that acknowledge and account for different layers of performativity that are at work in these sutras. So first, how the reenactment of the Buddha's speech by the performer of the Dharma generates dramatic effects. Right? Second, how that reenactment creates the conditions under which the Buddha's speech can continue to act on audiences. And third, how performing the role of a bodhisattva or Buddha, right, is understood to transform the speaker into a future. Right? It's on this latter point that I wish to focus today, right? Specifically, I want to examine how in the Vimalakirti Nirdesha and the Utmost Golden Radiance, metaphors for emptiness enact the sacrifice of the fleshly body and thus enable the ritual birth of the body of a Buddha. So keep in mind that in the ancient South Asian ritual cosmos, poetic utterance was from the Vedas onward the primary locus of ritual efficacy. Therefore, poetic speech acts can substitute for acts of ritual violence, right? Including the repeated self-sacrifice of bodhisattva. So in the examples we'll look at today, the ritual incorporation of the Buddha's verbal essence, the sutra itself, right, substitutes for acts of self-sacrifice that he undertook in order to become Buddha, right? And despite the substitution of verbal acts for corporeal acts, right, or perhaps because of the substitution, these verbal textual practices are presented in profoundly embodied terms, right, both in their process and in their result. So at the heart of these verbal techniques of self-sacrifice lies a profoundly performative theory and practice of metaphor, right? Metaphor empties the corporeal body. Metaphor enacts its sacrificial transformation. Metaphor births the eternal poetic body that is the telos of the ritual. Metaphor disseminates and perpetuates an immortal lineage of Buddhas. In other words, emptying the emptying of the body or the self, right? The sacrifice of that empty self and the generation of an eternal Buddha body in an eternal patrial lineage are all part of the same metaphorical So metaphor not only elucidates, but also enacts the emptiness, the shunyata of the body or self in the sutras, right? These metaphors recapitulate actually key phases, key ritual phases that were established in Vedic sacrificial paradigms that Buddhists and others adapted and transformed in many ways, right? The ritual generation of a sacrificial self, right? The relinquishment of that self, and the attainment of an eternal and perfected self that is identical with the ritual poetic verses that effected its transformation. Right? That's to say, these metaphors gained part of their power from their cultural, historical, cosmological, and ritual context, right? In the manner of cognitive metaphors. Yeah, but at the same time, they are, in the most robust sense, figures of speech. Right? Speech that makes and unmakes bodies. So, as both means and ends of a complex ritual poetic process of textual transfiguration, right? These really exceed categories of analysis that we usually use for metaphor and offer rich resources for rethinking metaphor. Perhaps even transculturally. I'll come back to that speculative point at the end. The substitution of one entity or process for another is, after all, the very life of sacrifice. Right? These metaphors open the possibility of conceiving of metaphor, and as I said, possibly all metaphor in ritual terms, and thereby open new possibilities for thought and action. So to be clear from the outset, I'm not making what some would call a theological argument here, right? I don't assume the validity or power of the ritual machinations that I'm looking to identify, but neither do I assume the validity or adequacy of, frankly, rather impoverished modern Western notions of what metaphor, not to mention language in general, is and does. And so we ought not to treat metaphor, I think, as a translocal ahistorical concept. That's a form of Euro-American universalism that needs to be challenged, right? I mean, it's too easy and frankly self-serving to presume and therefore, find confirmation of the unreality of the ritual linguistic cosmology informing Mahayana sutras and the reality of our own strange cosmology, right? Instead, what I'm aiming to do is to understand with more precision how metaphors work in an ancient South Asian sacrificial cosmology of reading, with the simple expectation that we might have some so here's what I want to do with the rest of this talk. First, I'm going to distinguish two different levels on which metaphor functions in these texts. Then I'll look at a passage from the Vimalakirti Nirdesha that I think exemplifies in extremely clear and concise terms the kind of metaphor-driven ritual, verbal act of self-sacrifice that I'm talking about here. And then with that as backdrop, I'll turn to the chapter on emptiness in the Suvarna, the Sutra of Utmost Golden Radiance, and show how it enacts a similar process in its own distinctive ways. And then finally, I'll consider briefly how these two instances might offer us interpretive resources for engaging with other such metaphors. I've started investigating other texts that, through Buddhist texts. I've started looking much more broadly, but I haven't sort of time to incorporate all of that into so first, I'm going to talk about the two levels of metaphor. So I'm going to call the more the diffuse and pervasive of these levels meta-metaphor. And here we're dealing with metaphors that both describe and enact the efficacy of language itself in sacrificial terms. So it's meta-metaphor, right? So the sutras are woven with strands of sacrificial meta-metaphor. These invoke the sutra's fiery brilliance and power, both to cook and to feed its audiences and speakers. They proclaim and enact its procreative potency and its gestation and its audiences. These are metaphors that pervade the sort of Vedic rituals that birth perfected bodies. Right? They make the words of the sutra into the liquid essence of supreme sovereignty with which audiences are then consecrated. All these interrelated figurations of the performative, transformative power of the sutra's language make practices involving the sutra into substitutes for sacrificial and self-sacrificial rituals. And like those rituals, these metaphors endow the sutra, right, the performed and the performative sutra, with the power to produce perfected immortal bodies by their own account. Right? On the second level, metaphors that enact sacrifice. So these metaphors, the meta metaphors, which I've explored elsewhere, right? Lay the ground for a more kind of granular level, and that's where I want to focus today, right? A level at which specific metaphors facilitate the imaginative enactment of sacrifice in these sutras, right? And it's this that I want to focus on, this case study for a set of recurring metaphors in Buddhist literature, both Mahayana and non-Mahayana, that make vivid and disturbing, otherwise abstract notions of the emptiness of the body yourself. This is a fairly consistent set of what Gomez and Harrison call stock images, evoking the ephemeral, fragmented, and disgusting nature of the corporeal body. Okay. So in the Vimalakirti Nadesha and the Atlas Golden Radiance, the metaphorical dissolution of the corporeal body occurs in stark juxtaposition with the verbal birth and apotheosis of a very different kind of body, right? Kaya, the Tathagata Kaya or Dharma Kaya of a Buddha, right? We see this in other sutras too, like Samadhi Raja. I'm not going to be talking about those today. This movement, right, relinquishing the fleshly sacrificial body and attaining thereby a perfect and eternal body, recapitulates South Asian sacrificial ritual. That's that. Right? So the sutras themselves claim both to effect the ritual transformation from mortal body to immortal and to constitute the perfect immortal Buddha body that is obtained thereby. Right? So by hearing, studying, memorizing, uttering the words that constitute the immortal essence of Buddhahood, the frail and foul bodies of mere mortals are progressively transformed into the perfect verbal bodies of Buddhas, incorporating Buddha Vachana, the speech of Buddhas, right, turns speakers and listeners into Buddha Vachana. That is, they acquire the eternal speech body of Buddhas. Right? So I want to begin with a look at the second chapter of the Vimalakirti Nadesha, called Inconceivable Strategic Virtuosity, right, by Kaushalya, which enacts, I think, with admirable economy and correctness, this metaphor-driven sacrifice of the immortal body and the birthing of a perfected immortal Buddha body. So this example, I think, will help shed light on the similar ritual dynamic that we see in the emptiness chapter of the Suvarna, the Sutra of Most Golden Radiance. In this second chapter, Vimalakirti's exercise of inconceivable Kaushalya, strategic virtuosity, if you will, frames the remainder of the sutra's narrative, right, in which a central theme is the hierarchical opposition between Dharma and Amisha, material objects or flesh sensuality, runs throughout the sutra. By feigning illness, Vimalakirti creates the opportunity to instruct his well-wishers on the fragility, repulsiveness, and unreality of the mortal body, and to extol, by contrast, the body of the Tathagata. When the people of the city and region hear of his illness, they all come to see how he's doing. And this is his pretext for offering his teaching on the impermanence and weakness of this body composed of the four elements. He launches into a litany of metaphors that bring this teaching vividly home. And I should note here that I'm using my own translation rather than the recent and excellent translation of Paris and Gomez, only because I want to emphasize the ritual structure of the passage and help to illuminate the parallels with the passages in the utmost polar radiance as well. Right? So here we go. Sorry for all the text, but hopefully you can see I've got the highlights on Yam Kayo throughout, so that sort of sense of a ritual rhythm that's happening throughout, right? He says, he says, dear friends, like a blob of foam is this body, unable to withstand the application of force. Like a bubble is this body, not enduring for long. Like a mirage is this body, generated through desires caused by afflictions. Like the trunk of a banana tree is this body, since it lacks any essential core, and so on and so forth. I'm not going to read them all. I just want to sort of give you a sense of how this long list unfolds, especially if it's being performed, which is the point I'm trying to make. Okay. So here's the second round, right? Inactive is this body like the earth, elements here. Without self is this body like water, lifeless is this body like fire, lacking personhood is this body like the wind, and so on. And going through this entire passage, really long passage, where we have a very distinct ritual rhythm that moves throughout it. And this final metaphor, I want to point out the murderers, like murderers, snakes, and an empty village is this body, comprised as it is of aggregates, elements, and sense faculties. This is the metaphor on which the utmost golden radiance concentrates in its emptiness chapter. So Vimalakirti concludes this inventory, right, this metaphorical inventory of transience and decay by saying, therefore you should generate disgust and aversion toward a body of such a form. You should generate yearning toward the body of a Tathagata. Sort of enacted disgust on the one hand, and now we're yearning for another body. And what is the body of a Tathagata? It is the body of Dharma, right? On some level, this is identical with the sutra itself, right? And that body receives a very different treatment, as you can imagine, right? Indeed, the focus becomes not on the nature of the body itself, but the acts that lead to its ritual rebirth. So this is what happens in that section, right? You get, dear friends, the body of Dharma is the body of a Tathagata, born of generosity, born of morality, born of contemplation, born of wisdom, born of liberation, so on and so forth, right? Born of the 37 wings of awakening, born of insight and tranquility, born of the 10 supernormal powers, born of the 4 fearlessnesses, and so on. So here, what we get is this series of 25 compounds, all ending in the past participle here, jata, born, echoing the designation of Vimalakirti himself at the beginning of the same chapter as born from the perfection of wisdom. And these are the only occurrences of Nirjata in the entire sutra, right? So an intense concentration right here. Vimalakirti's inconceivable strategic virtuosity, its upaya kaushalya, in other words, lies precisely in his performative demonstration of the vast superiority of the immortal Tathagata, born from virtuous and dharma-centered acts, okay? That are utterly distinct from those that produce the frail and defective corporeal body. And this contrast is established not only through content, but also through incantatory parallel repetition, through the ritual poetic use of language to mark and to make the transition from the verbal destruction of the fleshly body to the glorious birth of the indestructible Dharma body. So this passage doesn't merely contrast the two bodies, right? It also recapitulates in rhythmic prose the ritual process of sacrificing one's own body, right? Whether through a substitute victim, as in the Vedic sacrificial ritual, or through self-sacrifice, as in many Jataka tales, especially in the Mahayana tradition, right? In order, and what do you attain an immortal perfected body as a result, right? Just like in ritual. So paradigmatically, in Vedic kingship rituals, the sacrificer divests himself of his ordinary body, it's a ritual death, right? And begins to gestate a new body in the initiatory phase of the ritual, right? The Diksha. And both Vedic and Mahayana self-sacrificial practices have as their goal the attainment of a sovereign solar immortal body, right? That is often identified with the ritual language through which that body was attained. These ritual phases are not only invoked, but also performed when Vimalakirti heaps up metaphor upon metaphor in a sacrificial speech act that empties the fleshly body of life and value and cuts it into a heap of impurity and putrescence. And then follows that verbal destruction by giving verbal birth to the immortal perfected Dharmakaya or Tathagatakaya, right, of a Buddha. And actually, a subsequent chapter of the sutra identifies these ethical and verbal performative acts as a dharma yajna, a dharma sacrifice, right? And that bears the ritual fruit of an immortal Tathagata body. And in a culminating chapter of the sutra calls itself the great dharma sacrifice, Mahadharma yajna. So the text does actually figure its own performance as a sacrifice, right? And it does so explicitly. So in this passage, right, this passage that depicts the emptiness of the body or the self is also enacting that emptiness through metaphor and birthing an immortal Buddha body in its place. Okay. But a full appreciation of what's happening in this passage, I think, demands that we recognize that the text is, by its own normative account, meant to be performed, right? And that performance is itself an act of impersonation of the supremely eloquent Vimalakirti and of the embodiment both of the illness and fragility of that speaker's body and of the ritual potency of Buddha speech. So in acting the part of Vimalakirti, a consummate performer himself, right? The speaker is also performing the destruction of his own body and the bodies of audience members via metaphor, right? And enacting the process of birthing a new kind of body via the performance of the sutra. So with ritual speech, he makes the one body collapse, and the other come into imaginative being before the eyes of the audience. So the performance situation places the audience in the position of Vimalakirti's visitors and enacts what it describes. Through metaphor, mortal bodies become mere bubbles that arise and pass in an instant, while the textualized teachings of the Buddha come to constitute an eternal and transferable bodily essence that fills and transforms the into self. Speech is given substance to these metaphors, and practices of uttering, listening, memorizing, studying, and imaginatively realizing the sutra's words and worlds become methods of incorporation. The chapter on emptiness in the Sutra about Mystical and Radiance turns on a similar contrast between the emptiness of the ordinary immortal body and the immortal body of the Buddha. But it differs in the sense that it elaborates a narrower set of interconnected metaphors for the impermanence of the body, and a more material, substantial set of metaphors to trace the process of obtaining the Dharmakaya through hearing the text itself. It's worth noticing, noting the position of this chapter in the Sanskrit text, which has a strong ritual structure in the entire text, right? Almost from the outset, the sutra links its self-proclaimed status as a nutritive, seminal, consecratory essence to the self-sacrifice of the Bodhisattva, right? after a brief introductory chapter that extols the power of the sutra and stipulates the ritual preparations that are necessary for hearing it, the second chapter sets this ritual agenda by introducing the theme of self-sacrifice. In this chapter, the Bodhisattva Ruchira Ketu is confused about why the Buddha's lifespan is a mere 80 years. Right? Because the Buddha himself said that, to quote from the sutra, there are two causes and two conditions for a long life: refraining from killing living creatures and giving the gift of food. Right? And since for eons the Buddha refrained from killing living beings, right, and fed them with the flesh, bones, blood, and marrow of his own body, as well as other food, right? Why wouldn't he have an immeasurably long life? So this passage explicitly locates the causes of long life in the sacrificial arena, right? Yet in such a way as to directly undermine the performative paradigm of obtaining or immortality through sacrifice. The Buddha teaches that long life results from refraining from killing living beings, right? Sacrificing others, that is, right? And from feeding them even with one's own body, so sacrificing oneself. Yeah. The chapter reveals that the lifespan of the Buddha is, surprise, surprise, in fact, immeasurable, and that his true eternal body is the sutra itself. Right? Then in the third chapter, we get Deshana, sometimes translated sort of problematically, but what other choice do we have as confession, right? This is a ritual of recitation that expiates all possible evil acts that may have been committed in past lives for those who hear it. And then there's a brief fourth chapter that combines praises of the Buddhas, dwelling on the beauty of their bodies, with an elaborate multi-part resolve of pranidhana to attain Buddhahood through the power of the golden radiance of the sutra. On the surface, the chapter on emptiness that follows would seem to have little to do with what has come before, right? So we're talking about emptiness, but actually it continues this ritual trajectory by metaphorically emptying the mortal body and filling it up with the liquid essence of immortalizing nectar. Amrita rasa, dharma amrita rasa, which is a term used repeatedly in the sutra for its own sound, performed sound especially, right? So this is the essence of the sutra and the essence of Buddhahood. The chapter begins with a series of verses explaining that empty dharmas, which have been taught in such detail in other sutras, right, will be treated precisely in this sutra, which has been spoken with other means, methods, and motivations, the sutra tells us. The verses then shift abruptly to an extended meditation on the mortal body through the metaphor of the murderers, snakes, and empty village that concluded the list in the There are other shared metaphors between the two sutras as well, but in general, the Suvarna focuses, the utmost golden radiance focuses on one connected set of metaphors, whereas the Vimalakirti offers, as you've seen, a much more comprehensive list of these stock images of emptiness. So, in the Suvarna, these images of emptiness, there are many verses on them, so I haven't reproduced them all for you here. But these images of the emptiness of the body shift quite suddenly to a series of injunctions, right? Destroy the fallacy of the self, slash the net of afflictions with the sword of knowledge, consider the dwelling place of the aggregates to be empty, touch the marvelous quality of waste. Right? So after these metaphors have been played out around the emptiness of the body itself, we get this verse. And according to Johannes Nobel, who edited the Sanskrit, this verse stands on its own, and remaining verses in the chapter likewise have nothing more to do with the first part, right? And I want to disagree with that, because although the remaining verses do indeed seem to treat a rather different topic, right? In light of the passages in the Vimalakirti, it's clear that the two parts of the chapter are in fact quite closely connected. And that the verse we're looking at here is a hinge, right? just like Vimalakirti's pronouncement between emptying the ordinary body and the glorification of the Tathagata, right? It's a kind of when Vimalakirti says this, he says, he tells listeners, you should generate disgust and aversion toward a body of such a form. You should generate yearning toward the body of the Tathagata, right? I think this is fulfilling a similar function. This verse is a hitch. Right? And similarly, in the Utmost Golden Radiance, the preceding metaphors of insubstantiality and inadequacy regarding ordinary embodiment, right, give way to subsequent verses that are strikingly substantial and triumphal images of the attainment of awakening. As the Buddha proclaims in a set of rhythmically distinctive verses, I've opened the gate to the city of immortalizing nectar. The vessel with the liquor of immortality is revealed. I will enter the beautiful city of immortalizing nectar. I will drink my fill of the liquid essence of immortalizing nectar. I have struck the fine drum of the Dharma. I have sounded the fine conch of the Dharma. I have set alight the fine lamp of the Dharma. I have rained down the fine rain of the Dharma. I have vanquished those foreign enemies, the afflictions. I have hoisted the supreme banner of the Dharma. I have brought beings across the ocean of existence. I have blocked the three unfortunate paths of rebirth. So, as in the Vimalakirti, the emptiness of the fleshly body is contrasted with the fullness of the Dharma and being filled with the Dharma, right? These are also the first occurrences in the sutra of this key term, Amrita Rasa, right? The liquid essence of immortalizing nectar. And they foreshadow the repeated assertion in subsequent chapters that this Dharmamrita Rasa is the sound of the sutra as it is performed with eloquence by the Dharmabhanika. This immortalizing nectar of the Dharma produces intense physical effects as it enters and transforms the bodies of listeners, according to the sutra, when the sutra is performed. So the movement, the Vimalakirti Nirdesha, from the metaphorical destruction of the illusory body of flesh and the production of a perfect immortal Tathagata body is paralleled here by the contrast between the empty body identified with the false view of self and the verbal outpouring by both the Buddha and the performer of the sutra, right, of the nectar of the Dharma, which fills listeners with the essence of awakening and transforms their future bodies into the golden Dharma bodies of Buddhas. So the chapter then concludes, bringing us right back to sacrifice again, to which end, during innumerable previous eons, I revered Buddhas and numbers beyond thought, following resolute vows toward awakening, striving to obtain the body of Dharma, sacrificing hands and feet, gold and riches, jewels and pearls and ornaments, eyes and head, cherished sons and daughters, gold, beryl, and all sorts of jewels, right? Sacrificing then the empty material body and its material accoutrements, right, leads for the Buddha to the attainment of the body of Dharma. Yet, as the preceding verses make clear, he offers the same immortal body to others through his teachings, right? A body both generated and constituted, so the sutra maintained, right, by the Dharmamrita Rasa, the liquid immortalizing nectar of the Dharma, right? Of the sutra itself. So the sutra is both means and end of the verbal rituals of self-sacrifice that are so explicit in the chapter on emptiness that birth the Dharma body of a Buddha. And as in the Vedic sacrificial complex, the ritual production of perfected bodies depends on the enactment of a procreative process, right? Hearing the sutra enacts the sacrifice of the empty body of flesh and fills the listener with the liquid essence of the sutra, initiating the gestation of a Buddha body that will mature over multiple lifetimes. And this process parallels and substitutes for the bodily sacrifices of the Bodhisattva. Right? Incorporating the rasa of the sutra into one's ritually emptied body or self offers an alternative form of self-sacrifice when modeled on the inseminatory and gestational phases of Vedic sacrificial ritual, through which the sacrificer puts himself into puts himself a new eternal body in heaven, right? That's identical with the verses recited in the ritual. Gestation. Gestation of this immortalizing liquid essence of the Dharma, right, leads to birth ultimately as a Buddha. But since that body is identical to the sutra itself, gestating the sutra means preparing to perform, preparing to move from receptive listener, right, to eloquent speaker of this beautiful body, right? Incorporating the Dharma, essence of Buddha, promises nothing less than rebirth in progressively more perfect forms. And the Sutra of Utmost Golden Radiance has a kind of trajectory of interim births that explicitly incorporate royal rebirth as a stage of development, and establishes a relationship of profound interdependence between the king and the performer of the Dharma. Yeah? The performer of the Dharma anoints the king with his speech. For the liquid essence of the sutra produced by the performer of the Dharma, it's also the supreme consecratory essence of kingship, as well as Buddhahood, right? Without which a king cannot prosper. It's the Dharmabhanika, the performer of the sutra, who takes center stage in the process of birthing the Buddha's body, right? He is the producer of Buddhas, as the Buddha himself bears witness in his telling of a Jataka tale, where the king hears the sutra from a Dharmabhanika and becomes a Buddha thereby. He is a Buddha surrogate, as the Buddha explicitly instructs listeners to recognize in the 6th chapter of the sutra. And he is also himself predicted to Buddhahood by all the Buddhists in the cosmos, speaking in unison in that same chapter. In the chapter on emptiness, he impersonates the Buddha, right? He speaks the person of the Buddha into himself, right? And that too has Vedic precedence, right? Through memorization, he incorporates the Buddha's verbal essence, and through speech, he makes that essence present in all its perfect ritual power. And as he utters that speech, it first empties the bodies of listeners and fills them in turn with the eternal essence of the Dharma. He enacts the process he describes through metaphor, speech acts that make one thing into another. The body is made into an empty village. Then the words of the Dharmabhanika open the doors to the city of nectar and fill the ritually empty bodies of listeners. And there's an additional layer of self-referential complexity in the metaphorical speech act, for the substances and processes that are invoked by these interlinked sacrificial metaphors are the substance and acts of the speech itself. In uttering the self-sacrificial metaphors of the text, one is making Buddha speech into food or fire, body or nectar, and into the speech of one's own body, right? Which, according to the sutra, transforms as a result. I'm not saying that all examples of these stock images of emptiness work in this way, although that's something I'm in the process of investigating. Thus far, I note that examples of these metaphors in the Pali Suttas, for instance, tend to focus on dissolution, usually of the aggregates, right, without generating a perfect Buddha body. But occurrences of these metaphors in the Samadhi-raja lend themselves to similar readings, at least some of the occurrences, and maybe possibly also in Nagarjuna's the last one I've been just beginning to look at and thinking of the way it might work in some way. In any case, the substitutive logic that permeates both sacrifice and metaphor, right? Indeed, that enables metaphor to enact sacrifice, demands that we find a way to interpret literature as ritual. Yes, versa. This is the speculative part. Okay. The metaphorical sacrifice of the self or body in these Buddhist sutras both justifies and is justified by the binary opposition between the mortal fleshly body of the audience and the eternal poetic sutra body of the Buddha. Sacrificial metaphors recognize no boundary between ritual act and poetic act, right? Between what we modern scholars call religion and literature. If we want to understand a cosmos where figures of speech are endowed with the power to enact sacrifice or self-sacrifice, does it even make sense to maintain this boundary? Perhaps it obscures more than it clarifies. And maybe we have something to learn from these sutras about how our own language works. What if we read modern categories through the lens of the sutras and ask how the institution of the boundary between ritual and literature might itself constitute a ritual poetic act of sacrifice, one that empties or aims to empty language of its creative power. That's what I got. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Natalie. That's brought up so much.